on this computer.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay. So, do you see the screen now?
No, just you.
Oh, Lord.
You cut your hair.
Yes, I have. I felt that I needed a change. Share my screen. Let's start from the screen, and then there we have it.
There we go. Now it's there.
Yeah. This here. So yes, no comments on the political situation, but we will move directly to the content of the course. And we have reached the 20th lecture of my classical Greek introductory course. And today we are taking on a new tense, which is the perfect tense. And what we are learning today are the paradigms for the active perfect, as well as the active pluperfect. So this is how the first person singular perfect active indicative form of our paradigmatic verb by deo looks like. So this is a so-called perfect one type of active perfect. And the components we have here are, first of all, the stem, which we recognize by deo. Then in the perfect one, we have Kappa Infix, all between the stem and the ending. And further we have a so-called reduplication, which is placed before the stem of the verb. And finally, we have also the first person ending, which is here an alpha. So the full form is pepaideuka. Okay, but then if you look at the corresponding perfect two type of active perfects, we note that here the Kappa Infix is lacking, while the other components are the same as in the perfect one type of perfects. So we re-encounter here the reduplication, the root, and the ending as well. Okay. Next, we should deal with the different components in the active perfect forms a bit more thoroughly. So if we begin with the reduplication, we may note first that the reduplication is actually not a characteristic feature only of the perfect tense, but in classical Greek, some aorist and even some present tense verb forms are reduplicated. However, in the perfect tense, the reduplication is the rule rather than an exception. And in fact, all verb forms in the perfect tense are reduplicated, except for the formally perfect tense verb oida, I know, which however has a present meaning. And the way this reduplication works is as follows. When the root of the verb begins with a single consonant, except if that consonant is raw, as well as when the root begins with a dental, labial, or velar consonant followed by a lamba or a raw, or by a nasal, then the reduplication takes the form of a doubling of the first consonant in the verb stem followed by an epsilon. Thus, for instance, by deo, because the root begins with a single consonant other than raw, becomes pepaideuka in the active perfect indicative. And grapho, where the root begins with a wheeler followed by a raw, becomes gegrapha. And kamno, I toil, becomes kekmeka, because here the verb root is actually kme. That is, we have a wheeler followed by a nasal in the beginning of the root or stem. In this case. Okay, but you don't have to memorize the rules for the formation of the perfect stems that I'm going through here. But this is just to give some insight into the logic behind the formation of the stem. Okay. Anyway, if the root of the verb, on the other hand, begins with a raw, or with a sequence of consonants, which is not any of the previously mentioned combinations, then the reduplication follows a different logic. In this case, the reduplication is a simple epsilon. Thus, ripto becomes erifa in the active perfect indicative, with duplication of the initial raw as well in this case. And strateuo, I wage war, becomes estrateuka. So in these cases, when the reduplication mainly consists of the addition of an epsilon in front of the verb stem, the reduplication in the perfect form in question may, of course, be mistaken for an augment. But then we just have to look at the rest of the components to analyze it correctly. For instance, in cases where we are confronted with an active perfect of the perfect one type, we can identify the Kappa Infix, which allows us to conclude that we have before us a perfect form of a verb, and not, for instance, a sigmatic aorist, since the sigma infix is lacking. Okay. But then we have, of course, also verb stems beginning with a vowel. And in these, the perfect reduplication has originally been a simple epsilon as well. But this epsilon has then been contracted with the stem beginning vowel, so that the vowel has been lengthened. That's, for instance, the active perfect indicative form of agapao. I love is egapeka, and el pizzo, I hope, becomes elpika. Okay, moreover, we have, of course, also all the composite verbs with prepositional prefix before the actual verb stem. In these, just like when they receive an augment, the reduplication normally falls between the prepositional prefix and the verb stem. So that's, for instance, the active perfect indicative of entatto, I place in order, is entetaha. There is also a rare type of reduplication in connection with some verbs beginning with vowels, the so-called Attic reduplication, which we may observe, for instance, in the active indicative perfect form of the verb akuo, I hear, which is akeko in the active perfect. So here, both the initial vowel and the following consonant in the verb stem are actually reduplicated. And the initial vowel in the original verb stem is then also lengthened. And as is customary in Attic Greek, this vowel turns into an eta when thus lengthened, since it's not preceded by an epsilon. an iota or a row. Okay. So much for the perfect reduplication. If we turn to the Kappa Infix, which, as I said, is a specific characteristic of active perfects of the perfect one type, we may note too that its insertion may cause some changes in the verb stem. Usually, however, there are no such changes if the root of the verb ends in a diphthong, as in paideuo, where the root remains the same in the active perfect, epaideuka. However, if the root of the verb ends in a single vowel, this stem-ending vowel is usually, but not always, lengthened. That is before the perfect Kappa Infix, as we can see in the verb miseo, I hate, the active indicative perfect form of which is memiseka, as well as in plero, I feel, which becomes pepleroka in the active perfect. While on the other hand, deo, I bind, becomes dedeka. Indeed, in the last example, there is no lengthening of the final vowel, that is before the Kappa Infix. And also if the root of the verb ends in a liquid, a lamba or a raw, or a nasal, a my or a ny, the ending of the stem is usually not altered as a result of the addition of the Kappa Infix. Except if the stem ending consonant is a ny, in which case the ny usually changes to a gamma, which is then pronounced like an ng sound in front of the Kappa Infix. Or sometimes the ny may also just disappear. Thus, angelo, a report, becomes engelka. So no changes here in the stem ending consonant, while faino, I show, becomes pefanka, with the stem ending ny changing to a gamma, and the stem beginning phi reduplicated as a p. Whereas krino, I judge, becomes kekrika. So here the final ny disappears as it meets the Kappa infix in the active perfect form. However, there is also a number of verbs with roots ending in liquids or nasals, which do undergo changes in the vowel sounds within the roots of the verbs when the tense changes from the present to the perfect. These are typically verbs with roots consisting of a single syllable. Thus, for instance, stello, I send, has the active perfect indicative form estalka, while the perfect form of theiro, I destroy, is eftarka. Okay. That ends our overview of the formation of the active perfect. Please note, however, that this overview was not complete, while it should at least help you to learn to discern the most common types of active perfects and to distinguish them from other tenses. To what has been said thus far, may still be added that in connection with some active perfect verbs of the Kappa Infix lacking perfect II type, if the verb root ends in a labial or velar consonant, the stem ending consonant is normally also aspirated. Thus, for instance, the active perfect indicative of the verb kerito, I herald, with the verb stem keryk, becomes keriha, and pempo, I send, with the stem pomp, becomes pepomfa. Okay. But let us turn to a quick overview of the paradigms for the inflection of the active perfect forms. This you find on page 200, section 18.3 in the Cambridge Grammar of Classical Greek. So if we begin with the indicative, we have here pepaideuka in the first person singular, pepaideukas in the second person singular, pepaideuken in the third person singular, pepaideukamen in the first person plural, pepaideukate in the second person plural, and pepaideukasin in the third person plural. So worthy of notice here is that the person endings are largely the same as in the sigmatic aorist indicative, except for the third person plural ending, which here is asin, as opposed to on in the corresponding aorist form. Okay, turning to the subjunctive, then we have here pepaideuko in the first person singular, pepaideukes in the second person singular, pepaideuke in the third person singular, pepaideukomen in the first person plural, pepaideukete in the second person plural, and pepaideukosi in the third person plural. So we may note here that we have again the usual subjunctive endings, which are the same also in the present and the aorist. However, the proper perfect subjunctive forms are not very common. Instead, a so-called periphrastic or circumlocutory perfect subjunctive is usually used, which is a combination of a perfect participle and a subjunctive form of the verb aimi, I am. For instance, pepaideukos o is the first person singular form of the periphrastic active perfect subjunctive when the subject is masculine, and pepaideukia o when the subject is feminine. And then pepaideukotes omen again is the first person plural form when the subject is masculine, and pepaideukiai omen is the feminine variant. Okay. Then we can fast forward to the optative, where we have pepaideukoimi in the first person singular, pepaideukois in the second person singular, pepaideukoi in the third person singular, pepaideukoimen in the first person plural, pepaideukoite in the second person plural, and pepaideukoien in the third person plural. And what can we note here? Well, the optative oi suffix is here, the same as in the present active optative form, and the endings are the same as well. So nothing strange or new here. Of course, the reduplication and the Kappa Infix are the characteristic features of the perfect forms. Okay. But also in connection with the perfect active optative, the proper optative is rare, and instead the periphrastic forms are often used. For instance, pepaideukos eien is the first person singular periphrastic active perfect optative form when the subject is masculine. Okay, moving on. Active perfect imperative forms do not exist, so there is no need to learn those. The infinitive, however, is pepaideukenai, and the participles are pepaideukos in the nominative, and pepaideukotos in the genitive, masculine, and pepaideukia and pepaideukias in the feminine. And then we have pepaideukos and pepaideukotos for the neuter forms. So what is noteworthy here is, on the one hand, that the masculine and neuter forms, as usual, follow the second declension, while the feminine forms follow the first. But on the other hand, you may note that the masculine and neuter forms do not have this characteristic nt part as part of the ending, apart from the nominative forms, which you have grown accustomed to when it comes to active participle forms. But instead they have an ot sound in most numbers and cases. And this ot part here is also a good way to recognize an active perfect participle. Okay. All we have left when it comes to new verb forms today then is the pluperfect. This is normally, that is, when the verb stem begins with a consonant formed so that an augment is added before the reduplicated perfect stem of the verb. As we can see here on the screen in connection with our paradigmatic verb paideuo. However, if the perfect stem begins with a vowel, the pluperfect forms are usually not constructed with an augment. But let's now go through the pluperfect paradigm for paideuo. So here we have epepaideuke or epepaideuke in the first person singular, and epepaideukes or epepaideukes in the second person singular. Then epepaideukein in the third person singular, epepaideukemen or epepaideukemen in the first person plural, epepaideukete or epepaideukeite in the second person plural, and epepaideukesan or epepaideukesan in the third person plural. So as you can see, all of these forms receive an augment before the reduplicated perfect stem, which marks them as pluperfects. However, if the perfect stem begins with a vowel and the augment consequently is lacking, you can still identify the pluperfect through the specific pluperfect endings. Of these endings, the alternative forms you see in the first and second person singular are the older variants. So these endings are common in Homeric Greek, for instance, while the alternative forms in the first, second, and third person plural with the a diphthong as part of the ending are later ancient Greek variants. So if of these paradigms that we have gone through today, you could learn the ones for the active perfect indicative and the pluperfect by heart, that would be great. But I doubt, of course, that you will take the time to do it. But it would be fantastic if you would. Anyway, the time has finally come for the last topic of today, which is the meaning of the perfect and the pluperfect. How is the perfect used in classical Greek, and what does it mean? Well, in modern English, the perfect is normally used to give expression to acts or happenings which have been completed, but which are still somehow relevant. That is, relevant in the present moment from the point of view of the speaker. And in classical Greek as well, the perfect stem, and particularly in the indicative mood, is used to express a still relevant state, which has arisen as a result of some action or event. Thus, a Greek sentence with a verb in the perfect indicative can often be quite adequately translated into English with a perfect as well. So for instance, the sentence pollas epistolas moi geographas with the second person singular active perfect indicative form geographas can be translated as you have written many letters to me. However, just as it is only the aorist indicative, which refers specifically to the past, it's also merely the perfect indicative that refers specifically to the present. The other moods are neutral when it comes to the time of the actions referred to. But the pluperfect or the past perfect in turn always refers to a past state in both classical Greek and modern English. That is, to a state which is no longer relevant, but which was relevant in the past and which once existed as the result of a previous action. Thus, the Greek pluperfect, mostly at least, can also be quite adequately rendered with a past perfect in English. For instance, the sentence pollas epistolas moi geographas, containing the second person singular pluperfect active form geographas, can be translated as you had written many letters to me. Okay, thank you very much. That was all for today, and be sure to do your homework.